Here's something nobody prepares you for. When you finally start becoming who you actually are, it rarely feels like triumph. It feels like something has gone quietly wrong. The people around you seem confused. Decisions you used to make in a heartbeat now come with a strange delay, a pause you didn't used to have. And instead of the clarity you were promised, there's this unsettling sense that the ground has shifted and nobody sent you the memo. Carl Jung spent much of his life mapping this exact terrain, and what he found runs completely against the story we've been told. Becoming your true self isn't a graduation. There's no moment where the music swells and you finally feel complete. The signs that it's happening are so easy to misread that most people, right in the middle of the most important transformation of their lives, assume they're falling apart. They panic. They try to go back, and in trying to go back, they abandon the very thing that was trying to be born. Jung called this lifelong process individuation, which is a heavy word for something very simple. It's the slow work of becoming who you were underneath everything you learned to perform. And the reason it feels so disorienting is that the self you're becoming was never the self anyone rewarded you for. So when it starts surfacing, the whole system around you registers it as a malfunction. Today I want to walk you through 5 specific signs that this is happening to you right now. Not the obvious ones you'd read on a poster, but the quiet, easily missed shifts that Jung recognized as evidence of something real taking root. And by the end, you'll understand why the very things that feel like you're losing yourself are usually the first proof that you're finally arriving. Let me start with the one that catches people most off guard. The first sign is that you stop feeling the need to explain yourself. For most of your life, you probably carried an invisible obligation to make yourself understood. Someone would misread your intentions, and you'd feel this urgent pull to correct the record. Someone would disapprove of a choice, and you'd find yourself constructing a case for the defense before they'd even finished their sentence. You lived with a running justification, always half-drafted in the back of your mind, ready to deploy the moment anyone questioned you. Then one day, you notice it's gone. Someone misunderstands you, and instead of the old scramble to fix it, there's a pause. A small, quiet space where the explanation used to live. And in that space, you realize something almost startling. You don't need them to get it. You can let the misunderstanding sit there, uncorrected, and the world doesn't end. Jung understood this compulsion to explain as a symptom of living through the persona, the social mask we build to be acceptable to the people whose approval once kept us safe. The persona survives on being understood, because being understood is how it earns its keep. When you're identified with the mask, other people's perception of you feels like a matter of survival. If they misread you, some part of you genuinely believes you're in danger. So you explain and explain and explain. Think about the person who ends a difficult conversation and then spends the next 2 hours mentally rehearsing everything they should have said, composing the perfect message that would finally make the other person understand. That endless internal editing isn't communication. It's the mask trying to manage its own reflection in someone else's eyes. When you start becoming your true self, that machinery goes quiet. Not because you've stopped caring about people, but because your sense of who you are has moved. It's no longer stored in other people's opinions. It's found a home somewhere inside you that doesn't require external confirmation to stay standing. Jung would say the center of gravity has shifted from the persona towards something deeper. And once that shift happens, being misunderstood stops feeling like a wound. It just feels like information about the limits of what someone else can see. This is why the pause matters so much. That small silence before you decide whether to defend yourself is the first physical evidence that you're no longer running on autopilot. The old you had no gap. The reaction and the justification were fused together, instantaneous. The new you has a breath in between, and in that breath, a choice lives that never existed before. But here's what makes this sign so easy to misread. From the outside, and sometimes from the inside too, it can look like you've become withdrawn or cold. People who were used to you over-explaining, over-reassuring, over-managing their comfort suddenly find you quieter. They notice you're not scrambling anymore, and some of them will interpret that as you pulling away, when what's really happening is that you've stopped performing a version of intimacy that was mostly about keeping them comfortable. Which brings us straight into the second sign, and this one hurts. The second sign is that certain relationships begin to fade, and you don't chase them. This is the part of becoming yourself that the inspirational content conveniently skips. Because the truth Jung observed again and again is that some of your relationships were never built on who you are. They were built on who you were pretending to be. They ran on the persona, on your compliance, on the particular role you agreed to play. And when you stop playing that role, the connection has nothing left to hold on to. You'll notice it first as a kind of drift. Conversations that used to flow now feel like work. You find yourself with less to say to people you once talked to for hours. There's a heaviness that settles over interactions that used to feel light, and for a while you can't name it. You wonder if you're depressed, or if you've become bitter, or if there's something wrong with your capacity to love. What's actually happening is more precise than that. You're outgrowing arrangements that required a smaller version of you. The friend who loved you most when you were the reliable one who never had needs of their own. The family member whose affection depended on you never rocking the boat. The partner who was drawn to your endless accommodation and finds your emerging boundaries genuinely alarming. These weren't villains. In most cases, they were people who loved what you did for them, and the person underneath all that doing was never really on the table. Jung was unflinching about this cost. He recognized that individuation almost always means losing connections that can't survive the death of the false self. Not because you're rejecting people, but because those connections were load-bearing walls in a structure you're dismantling, and you can't dismantle the structure and keep every wall. Consider the person who has been the designated peacemaker in their family for 30 years. The one who absorbs everyone's tension, smooths over every conflict, makes sure no gathering ends in a blow-up. Their whole place in the family is built on that function. Now imagine that person begins to change. They stop absorbing. They say, quietly, that they're not going to referee anymore. Watch how quickly the family that adored them starts describing them as difficult, as selfish, as having changed, and not for the better. That reaction isn't about your character. It's about the system losing a part it depended on. And the pause returns here too, in a different form. Where you once would have rushed to repair the fading connection, to overgive your way back into everyone's good graces, now there's a hesitation. A moment where you ask yourself a question you never used to ask. Do I actually want to hold on to this? Or do I just want to avoid the discomfort of letting it go? Most people standing in that pause feel enormous guilt. It can look from the inside like you've become someone who abandons people. But Jung would frame it differently. He'd say you're finally distinguishing between relationships that require your absence and relationships that require your presence. The ones fading away were sustained by your absence, by the way you disappeared behind the role you played. What's coming next will only be sustainable if you actually show up as yourself, and you can't do both at once. I know how lonely this stretch can feel. You're too changed for the old world, and the new one hasn't arrived yet. If you're in that in-between right now, watching connections thin out and wondering whether you're becoming someone worse, I want to point you towards something we built for exactly this passage. It's a guide called True Self-Discovery. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's work, designed to help you sit with these losses without rushing to undo them, and to hear what's actually trying to emerge underneath the drift. It's meant to keep you company while the ground is still shifting. You'll find it linked right below. Now let's keep going, because the third sign is the one people least expect. The third sign is that emotions you thought you'd mastered start coming back to life. For years, maybe decades, you may have thought of yourself as calm, even-tempered. The one who doesn't get angry, doesn't make a scene, doesn't fall apart. You wore that steadiness like a badge, and part of you was genuinely proud of it. Then, right in the middle of becoming yourself, something strange happens. The anger returns. The desire returns. Feelings you'd filed away as immature or dangerous start rising up in you with a force that frankly scares you. This terrifies people because they interpret it as regression. They think they're getting worse, becoming volatile, losing the hard-won composure they built their identity around. What Jung understood is the opposite. That composure was never maturity. It was suppression wearing maturity's clothes. Here's the mechanism. When you build a persona, you don't just decide who to be, you decide who not to be. Every trait that didn't fit the acceptable version of you got exiled into what Jung called the shadow, the storehouse of everything you learned to reject about yourself. If your survival depended on being agreeable, your anger went into the shadow. If it depended on being self-sufficient, your longing and neediness went into the shadow. If it depended on being good, then every hungry, wanting, ambitious, appetite-driven part of you got locked away as something shameful. And the shadow doesn't dissolve, it waits. It holds everything you disowned, and it holds it with remarkable patience. So when you begin to individuate, when the mask starts loosening its grip, all of that exiled material comes flooding back up toward the surface. The anger you never let yourself feel, the wants you were told were selfish, the parts of you that were too much, too loud, too intense for the environment you grew up in. Picture someone who spent their entire childhood learning to be small so they wouldn't set off an unpredictable parent. They became an expert at reading the room, at making themselves easy, at swallowing every complaint before it reached their throat. Now, in their 40s, they start becoming who they actually are, and suddenly they're furious. Furious about things that happened decades ago. Furious in traffic, furious at small injustices, furious in a way that feels completely out of proportion. They think they're having a breakdown. Jung would recognize it instantly. That fury isn't new, it's 40 years old. It's every legitimate anger they swallowed to stay safe, finally arriving now that it's safe enough to arrive. The feeling isn't a malfunction, it's a delivery, long delayed. The work here isn't to suppress these emotions again, and it isn't to be run by them either. It's to receive them. To let the anger inform you about where your boundaries actually are. To let the desire tell you what you actually want, after years of wanting only what you were permitted to want. Jung believed that a person cut off from their shadow is only living half a life, running on a fraction of their available energy. Because the same wall that holds back your anger also holds back your aliveness. The same numbing that protects you from grief also flattens your capacity for joy. And notice the pause again, in yet another shape. The old you felt an emotion and immediately shoved it down before it could show. The new you feels it and, for a moment, lets it be there. Lets the anger exist without acting on it and without erasing it. That pause, that willingness to hold a feeling instead of instantly managing it, is one of the surest signs that the real you is coming back online. The feelings were always yours. You're just finally home to receive them. Which leads directly to the fourth sign, and this one changes everything about how you move through the world. The fourth sign is that you stop consulting the invisible committee before you make a decision. Most people carry a crowd around inside their heads, not literally but functionally. Before any significant choice, there's an instant internal poll. What would my mother think? How will this look to my colleagues? What would people say? Is this the responsible thing? The acceptable thing? The thing that keeps everyone comfortable? This committee meets constantly, and for most of your life, you probably didn't even know it was in session, because its verdicts felt exactly like your own thoughts. Jung described how the voices of the people who shaped us get internalized so completely that we mistake them for ourselves. The parent's disapproval becomes an inner critic. The culture's definition of success becomes a private ambition. The tribe's rules become instincts. You end up living a life directed by a committee you never chose, casting votes on your behalf, and you call the result your own free will. The fourth sign is that the committee starts losing its authority. You'll catch it happening in small moments first. You'll be about to make a choice, and out of habit, you'll reach for the internal poll, and you'll find that the votes just don't carry the weight they used to. Your mother's imagined disapproval registers, but it no longer decides. The imagined judgment of the crowd flickers past, and you notice it, and you make your choice anyway, based on something else. Something quieter and more central. That something is what Jung called the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche that includes everything the ego tried to exclude. When you start deciding from the self rather than from the committee, decisions feel different, slower sometimes. There's that pause again. But now it's a pause with a purpose. You're not stalling. You're checking in with a center that actually belongs to you, instead of taking a head count of everyone else's expectations. Think of the person who spent 20 years in a career they chose to satisfy a father who's now long gone, and who wakes up one morning realizing that the vote which shaped their entire adult life was cast by someone who isn't even in the room anymore. That recognition is dizzying. It means the map they've been following was drawn by other hands. And when the committee's authority collapses, there's often a period of vertigo, because for the first time, you're facing choices without the old machinery telling you what to do. This can look like indecision from the outside. People might tell you that you've become flaky, that you don't know what you want anymore, that you used to be so sure of yourself. What they don't understand is that your old certainty was borrowed. It was the certainty of someone reading confidently from a script written by others. The temporary uncertainty you're feeling now is the honest confusion of a person learning to write their own lines for the first time. That confusion is 100 times more valuable than the fake clarity that came before it. And the strange thing is, once you learn to make decisions from the self, a new kind of certainty appears, deeper than the old one. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up as a quiet, unshakable sense of rightness about a choice that might look wrong to everyone watching. You'll do something that makes no sense to the people still living inside their committees, and it will feel entirely, calmly correct to you. That inner confirmation, arriving without a single external vote, is one of the clearest markers that you've stopped performing a life and started living one. Which brings us to the fifth and final sign, and in many ways, it's the one everything else has been building toward. The fifth sign is that solitude stops feeling like punishment and starts feeling like home. For most of your life, being alone may have carried a faint dread. An empty evening felt like something to fill. A weekend with no plans felt like evidence that you'd failed at connection somehow. You kept the noise going, the calendar full, the phone within reach, because silence had a way of surfacing feelings you didn't want to meet. Solitude, for the persona, is a threat, because the persona only exists in relation to an audience. Take away the audience, and the mask has nothing to do. It flickers and starts to dissolve, and that dissolution used to feel like a small death. Then, somewhere in the process of becoming yourself, that flips. You find yourself craving the empty evening, actually looking forward to the weekend with no plans. And when you're alone now, you're not restlessly waiting for it to end. You're at rest. The silence that once surfaced everything you were avoiding now feels more like company than absence. You can sit with yourself, and the person sitting there is someone you're starting to genuinely enjoy. Jung considered this one of the deepest markers of individuation, this shift in your relationship to being alone. Because a person who has integrated their true self is no longer alone, even in solitude. They've built a relationship with the deeper center of who they are, and that relationship travels with them everywhere. The companionship they used to seek desperately from other people turns out to be available from within, which doesn't make them a hermit. Jung argued the opposite, that only a person who's whole enough to be content alone can connect with others honestly, because they're no longer approaching every relationship as a starving person approaches food. Watch the difference in how such a person shows up. The old you might have stayed in a draining relationship simply because being in it felt marginally better than being alone. The fear of solitude made you tolerate almost anything. But once solitude becomes a place you can rest, rather than a fate you're fleeing, your whole relationship to connection changes. You stop clinging. You stop settling. You stop mistaking the mere presence of another person for intimacy. You can walk toward people from fullness instead of from lack, and you can walk away when something isn't right, because being alone is no longer the worst-case scenario you'll do anything to avoid. And notice, one last time, the pause that runs through all of this. In the old life, the pull of solitude would trigger an immediate reflex to reach for the phone, to make a plan, to escape the quiet before it could touch you. Now there's a gap, a moment where you feel the old reflex and simply choose not to obey it. You let the quiet in, and in that quiet, you meet the person you've spent your whole life outrunning, And to your surprise, they're not the frightening stranger you imagined. They're just you, the one who was always there underneath, waiting for the noise to stop long enough to be found. I want to gather these 5 signs together for a moment, because seen as a whole, they tell a single story. You stop explaining yourself because your identity has moved somewhere solid inside you. Certain relationships fade because they were built on a version of you that's dissolving. Old buried emotions come roaring back because the wall that suppressed them is coming down. The internal committee loses its authority because you're finally deciding from your own center. And solitude turns into home because you've built a relationship with the self you were always meant to be. Every one of these signs, notice, tends to feel like a loss when you're inside it. Loss of the need for approval, loss of relationships, loss of your hard-won composure, loss of the certainty the committee provided, loss of the constant company you used to surround yourself with. From the outside, and often from the inside too, becoming your true self can look like a slow accumulation of subtractions. And that's exactly why so many people, right at the threshold, turn back. They mistake the shedding for a decline. They feel everything falling away and assume the falling is the tragedy, when the falling is the whole point. Jung's radical claim was that what feels like subtraction is actually revelation. You're not losing yourself, you're losing everything that was covering you. The approval seeking, the roles, the suppression, the borrowed decisions, the fear of your own company. All of it was scaffolding built around a building nobody had ever seen, including you. And when the scaffolding comes down, it looks for all the world like demolition, right up until the moment you realize the building was there the whole time, finally standing free. There's one more thing worth naming because it's the part people most need to hear. This process doesn't come with a certificate. There's no final day when you're declared finished, fully yourself, transformation complete. Individuation isn't a destination you reach. It's a direction you keep turning toward, over and over for the rest of your life. You'll shed a layer, feel more like yourself than ever, and then discover another layer underneath. That's not failure. That's the nature of being a living psyche rather than a finished product. So if you recognized yourself in these 5 signs, if you've been feeling the drift and the anger and the strange new pauses and the pull towards solitude and quietly wondering whether something's gone wrong with you, I want to leave you with what Jung would almost certainly say. Nothing has gone wrong. Something has gone deeply, unmistakably right. The disorientation is the price of admission to a life that's actually yours, rather than one assembled from everyone else's expectations of who you should be. The person you're becoming was never a stranger. They were the one underneath all of it, present in every pause, waiting through every performance, patient through all the years you spent being who you thought you had to be. And the fact that you can feel them stirring now, uncomfortable as it is, means the most honest chapter of your life has already begun. You don't have to force it, you just have to stop turning back. Let the old life keep falling away, and pay attention to what stays standing when it's gone. That thing that stays standing, quiet and unhurried, and finally at ease in its own company, is you. If any of this landed close to home, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was made for exactly this stretch of the road. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, built to help you meet the self that's emerging rather than run from it, and to steady yourself through the losses that come before the arrival. It's a way to walk with this process instead of white-knuckling through it alone. You'll find it linked right below. Wherever you are in the shedding, keep going. What's underneath is worth every layer you let fall.